Danielle Carter had spent years perfecting the art of composure. In the world of corporate consulting, where she was often the only black woman in the room, keeping her cool wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. But as she sat in seat 14C, the one she had specifically booked weeks ago for its extra legroom, she felt her patience wearing thin, like a rope slowly fraying under pressure. "Excuse me," the voice came again, sharp and insistent. "I said, my daughter needs the window seat. You'll have to move." Danielle turned to see a woman standing in the aisle, blonde, mid-40s, with expensive sunglasses perched atop her head, despite the fact that they were inside an airplane. Her manicured hand rested firmly on the shoulder of a young girl, no older than 8. The child looked embarrassed, her gaze fixed downward, fingers nervously twisting the strap of her pink backpack. "I'm sorry," Danielle repeated, keeping her tone calm even as frustration tightened in her chest. "But this is my assigned seat. I specifically booked it for the extra space." The woman's eyes flicked over Danielle, her neatly pressed business suit, her perfectly styled curls, the open laptop on the tray table. There was something in that gaze, something Danielle had encountered before. The silent evaluation, the dismissal. The woman leaned in, lowering her voice to a whisper that was still loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "My daughter has flight anxiety. She needs the window. Surely you understand." Danielle understood plenty. She understood what it was like to have doors close in her face for no reason other than who she was. She understood the pressure of having to prove, time and again, that she belonged in spaces where others assumed she didn't. And she understood exactly what was happening right now. "Ma'am, my seat assignment is 14C. Your daughter's seat is wherever you were assigned. I'm not moving." The woman's face flushed with frustration. "I need to speak to a flight attendant." "Be my guest," Danielle said, turning back to her laptop. A half-finished presentation awaited her, the final touches for tomorrow's meeting with Sterling & Co., a prestigious client, eager to improve their company's diversity and inclusion initiatives. The irony wasn't lost on her. As the woman stormed off to find a crew member, Danielle noticed an older man across the aisle watching the interaction. He offered her a small, sympathetic nod, the kind of silent acknowledgement she had seen many times before. The kind that said, "I see what's happening, but I won't get involved." The flight had already been delayed 40 minutes. Danielle needed to focus, she needed to prepare, she needed to avoid becoming the subject of yet another viral video featuring a black woman being removed from a plane for simply standing her ground. She didn't need this. Not today. Not when Sterling & Co. was finally within reach after months of careful negotiation. Not when she had promised her mother she would be home for her birthday dinner tomorrow night. The rhythmic click of determined footsteps made Danielle look up. The woman was back, her triumphant expression firmly in place. Beside her stood a flight attendant, Emily, according to her name tag. She looked to be in her mid-20s, her customer service smile unreadable. "Hi there, is there a problem?" Emily asked, scanning between them. Before Danielle could respond, the woman jumped in. "Yes, my daughter needs the window seat for her anxiety, and this lady refuses to move. We're in row 14, seats A and B." Emily consulted her tablet. "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Lauren Whitman," the woman answered, chin lifted defiantly. Danielle pressed her lips together to keep from reacting. The name fit almost too perfectly. Emily tapped at her screen. "Ms. Whitman, I see that you and your daughter are actually assigned to row 22, seats A and B." Lauren waved a dismissive hand. "Yes, but those seats don't recline properly, and my daughter needs the window for her anxiety. Surely you can rearrange things for a child." Emily turned to Danielle. "And you are?" "Danielle Carter, seat 14C. She handed over her boarding pass as proof. Emily nodded, checking her screen again. "Yes, Miss Carter is correctly seated." "Miss Whitman, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you and your daughter to return to your assigned seats." Lauren's face darkened. "Excuse me? My daughter has special needs. Surely this woman can move to accommodate a child." Emily's expression remained composed. "Your daughter's needs should have been noted when you made your reservation. If accommodations were required, they should have been arranged at that time. Miss Carter paid for and was assigned this seat. She is not obligated to move." A hush settled over the cabin, the kind of silence that meant people were listening, waiting for the conflict to unfold. Lauren's voice rose. I can't believe this. Is this how your airline treats families? Prioritizing one person over a child's needs? Emily's tone dropped slightly, steady but firm. Miss Whitman, all of our passengers deserve respect and their assigned seats. Now, I can help you find 2 seats together elsewhere on the plane if yours aren't, but Miss Carter does not need to be involved in that solution. Lauren's eyes flashed between Emily and Danielle, her outrage simmering beneath the surface. For a moment, Danielle wondered whether she would push further, escalate the situation, but instead, Lauren exhaled sharply and grabbed her daughter's hand. Fine. We'll remember this experience when choosing airlines in the future. Danielle exhaled quietly as Lauren led her daughter away. Emily turned back to her. I apologize for the disturbance, Miss Carter. Can I get you anything before takeoff? Danielle shook her head, a wave of relief washing over her. No, thank you. I appreciate your help. Emily gave a small nod. Just doing my job. Everyone deserves to fly without harassment. As the flight attendant walked away, Danielle finally allowed her shoulders to relax. She glanced out the window at the busy tarmac below, watching the ground crew move about like tiny figures in an orchestrated dance. She tried to refocus on her presentation, but her mind kept circling back to what had just happened. Not because it was shocking, because it wasn't, but because this time, someone in authority had actually taken her side. And that, in itself, was unusual. She had just turned back to her laptop when a voice from the aisle made her look up. Excuse me. A man in his 30s, casually dressed in dark jeans and a crisp button-down, slid into the seat beside her. He extended a hand with an easy smile. Jason Reed, he said. I couldn't help but notice what just happened. You handled yourself with class. Danielle shook his hand, surprised by the gesture. Danielle Carter. She offered a small, tired smile. Not my first rodeo, unfortunately. Jason nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. I know that feeling. Mind if I ask what you're working on? She gestured to her laptop. Diversity and inclusion strategy for a corporate firm. I'm pitching it tomorrow morning. Jason's eyebrows lifted. No kidding? I'm in HR at Attendant Financial. We just launched a similar initiative last quarter. And just like that, the tension from the earlier conflict began to fade, replaced by an unexpected conversation. One that, unknown to Danielle, would change more than just the course of her flight. 2 seats together elsewhere on the plane if yours aren't. But Miss Carter doesn't need to be involved in that solution. Lauren Whitman stared at the flight attendant, then at Danielle Carter, her expression shifting from disbelief to something colder, sharper. Fine, she spat, grabbing her daughter's hand. We'll remember this experience when choosing airlines in the future. With that, she turned and stalked toward the back of the plane. Emily, the flight attendant, exhaled softly before turning back to Danielle. I apologize for the disturbance, Miss Carter. Can I get you anything before takeoff? Danielle shook her head. No, thank you. I appreciate your help. Emily gave her a small nod. Just doing my job. Everyone deserves to fly without harassment. As Emily walked away, Danielle finally felt some of the tension in her shoulders release. She glanced out the window at the tarmac below, where ground crews bustled around like tiny figures in a choreographed routine. She needed to refocus on her presentation, needed to prepare. But her mind kept circling back to what had just happened. Not because it was unusual, because it wasn't. What made this time different was that someone in authority had actually taken her side. She had just turned back to her laptop when a voice from the aisle caught her attention. Excuse me. Danielle looked up to find a man sliding into the middle seat beside her. He appeared to be in his early 30s, casually dressed in dark jeans and a button-down, his expression open and friendly. Jason Reed, he said, extending a hand. I couldn't help but notice what happened. You handled yourself with class. Danielle blinked, momentarily surprised by the gesture before shaking his hand. Danielle Carter. She offered a small, wry smile. Not my first rodeo, unfortunately. Jason nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. I know that feeling. Mind if I ask what you're working on? She gestured to her laptop. Diversity and inclusion strategy for a corporate firm. I'm pitching it tomorrow morning. Jason's eyebrows lifted. No kidding? I'm in HR at Attendant Financial. We just launched a similar initiative last quarter. And just like that, the unpleasant encounter began to fade as they fell into an easy conversation about workplace culture and change management. By the time the plane pushed back from the gate, Danielle had not only a potential new professional contact, but also the beginnings of what felt like it could be a genuine connection. As the engines roared to life and the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway, Danielle caught a glimpse of Lauren Whitman several rows back. The woman's expression was still set in hard lines of displeasure. Their eyes met briefly, and Danielle wondered what story Lauren was telling herself about what had just happened. What justifications she was creating to maintain her worldview. Then the plane lifted off, pressing Danielle back into her seat, and she turned her gaze toward the sky, leaving Lauren Whitman and her assumptions far below. What Danielle couldn't have known then, as the aircraft climbed through the clouds, was that this brief encounter would set in motion events that would alter not just her career, but her entire life. That sometimes, justice comes in unexpected ways. And that retribution has its own timeline. That the woman glaring at the back of her head would soon play a much larger role in her story than a petty dispute over airplane seating. The universe, after all, has its own way of balancing accounts. By the time the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Danielle and Jason had discovered they had more in common than just a professional interest in diversity initiatives. Both had grown up in Boston, though in different neighborhoods. Both had attended HBCUs, Danielle at Spelman, Jason at Morehouse. Both had navigated the often isolating experience of being the only black person in a room full of corporate decision-makers. "So, what brings you to Chicago?" Jason asked as the flight attendants began beverage service. "Client pitch tomorrow, then my mom's birthday dinner," Danielle replied. "She moved there after retiring last year." "Nice. I'm headed to a conference on organizational psychology, presenting a paper on microaggressions in performance reviews." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Now that's something I could have contributed data points to." Jason laughed, a warm sound that drew a few glances from nearby passengers. "I bet. What's your worst one?" Danielle accepted a cup of coffee from Emily with a nod of thanks. She considered the question before answering. "So many contenders, but probably when my first boss told me I was surprisingly articulate during my performance review, then couldn't understand why I wasn't taking it as a compliment." Jason winced. "Classic. I got 'you're not like other black men' from a senior VP last year. Right in the middle of a leadership meeting. What did you do?" Asked her to explain what she meant. Watched her dig herself into a hole for about 2 excruciating minutes before she changed the subject. Their conversation was interrupted when Emily stopped by their row again. "Miss Carter, I wanted to let you know that the woman from earlier has made a formal complaint about you to the senior flight attendant." Danielle sat her coffee down carefully. "About me? What possible grounds does she have?" Emily lowered her voice. "She's claiming you were hostile and used inappropriate language." Danielle inhaled sharply, a familiar tightness forming in her chest. Emily continued, "For what it's worth, I've informed my colleague that I witnessed the entire interaction and that her claims are false." Danielle exhaled slowly. "Thank you, I appreciate you speaking up." Emily hesitated, then added, "It happens more than you might think. Some passengers believe they can get what they want by making accusations." After she moved on, Jason turned to Danielle. "You okay?" Danielle sighed. "Just tired of it, you know, the constant need to be perfect, to never show frustration. Because one wrong move validates every stereotype they already carry around." Jason nodded. "The emotional tax, it's exhausting." They fell silent for a moment, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Then Jason shifted, his expression lightening. "Tell me about your pitch tomorrow," he said. "Maybe talking it through will help take your mind off this." And just like that, the conversation shifted, away from frustration and toward something else, something promising. Grateful for the shift in conversation, Danielle began outlining the framework she had developed, an approach that addressed not just hiring practices, but also retention, promotion pathways, and overall cultural transformation. As she spoke, the earlier frustration from her encounter with Lauren Whitman slowly faded into the background, replaced by the passion she had always carried for this work. The problem with most diversity initiatives, she explained, is that they focus too much on getting diverse candidates in the door and not enough on what happens once they're inside. Exactly, Jason agreed. Too many companies treat diversity like a PR stunt, rather than a true restructuring of workplace culture. Their conversation flowed effortlessly. Two professionals exchanging insights and experiences, occasionally punctuated by laughter or the quiet understanding that didn't require words. Time passed more quickly than Danielle had anticipated, and before she knew it, the captain was announcing their initial descent into Chicago. Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "I'd like to stay in touch if that's okay. Maybe we could grab coffee while we're both in town?" Danielle accepted the card, running her fingers over the embossed Ashton Financial logo. "I'd like that. My pitch is at 10 a.m. tomorrow, but I should be free by noon." "Perfect. Text me when you're done and we'll figure something out." As they exchanged contact information, Danielle reflected on the strange symmetry of the day. How an unpleasant encounter had unexpectedly led to a promising connection. Maybe there was a lesson in that. The unpredictable nature of adversity. How it sometimes created opportunities even as it built obstacles. The plane began its final approach, Chicago sprawling below them like a vast circuit board, its lights blinking against the early evening sky. Danielle carefully tucked her presentation materials into her leather portfolio. "Good luck tomorrow," Jason said. "Though from what you've told me, I don't think you'll need it." "Thanks. I hope your conference session goes well too." As the aircraft touched down with a gentle bump, Danielle felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Chicago had always been just another stop on her business travel itinerary. But now, with her mother having relocated here and a new acquaintance suggesting coffee, it felt like something more. A place where something significant might happen. She just didn't know yet whether that something would be wonderful or disastrous. Or perhaps both. The Sterling & Co. headquarters occupied the upper floors of a sleek glass tower in downtown Chicago, the kind of building designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant before they even reached the reception desk. Danielle had been in countless such buildings throughout her consulting career, but she never quite got used to how their architecture served as a tangible representation of corporate power dynamics. As she rode the elevator to the 47th floor, she mentally ran through her presentation one last time. She had spent 2 hours that morning reviewing her slides, rehearsing her delivery, and preparing responses to potential questions. The pitch was solid. She knew it was solid. Now she just had to silence the doubts that always seemed to creep in before high-stakes meetings, the doubts that had only been amplified by yesterday's confrontation on the plane. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a reception area decorated in understated shades of gray and blue. The Sterling & Co. logo, a stylized lighthouse, was mounted on the wall behind the front desk. She approached the receptionist, a young man with fashionably rectangular glasses. "Danielle Carter for the 10 with Mr. Sterling," she said smoothly. The receptionist nodded. "Yes, Miss Carter. They're expecting you in the harbor room. Can I get you anything before I show you in? Water? Coffee?" "Water would be great, thank you." As she followed him down a corridor lined with black and white photographs of historic Chicago architecture, Danielle shifted into what she called performance mode. Shoulders back, chin up, steps measured and confident. It was a posture she had mastered over years of being the only black woman in rooms filled with white men who controlled the decisions, the budgets, and the opportunities. The harbor room turned out to be a corner conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of Lake Michigan. Around the massive oval table sat 5 people, 3 men, 2 women, all watching as she entered. A distinguished older man at the head of the table stood to greet her, extending his hand. "Miss Carter, welcome to Sterling & Co. I'm William Sterling. We've been looking forward to your presentation." Danielle shook his hand, then moved around the table as the others introduced themselves. Catherine Langley, Chief Operating Officer. James Halpern, Vice President of Human Resources. Michael Trent, General Counsel. And Lauren Whitman, Head of Talent Acquisition. Danielle's steps faltered for just a fraction of a second as she extended her hand to the last person, the same woman from the plane. Now dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. Recognition flickered in Lauren's eyes, followed quickly by something harder to read. Surprise or calculation? "Miss Carter," Lauren said, her handshake brief and impersonal. "We meet again." Across the table, William Sterling glanced between them. "You two know each other?" Before Danielle could respond, Lauren gave a thin smile. "We were on the same flight yesterday." Danielle held her expression steady, even as her pulse quickened. Of all the companies in Chicago, she had to walk into the one where Lauren Whitman worked. "Small world indeed," she replied smoothly, keeping her professional mask firmly in place. "Well, that's excellent," William said, oblivious to the underlying tension. "Always good to have a connection already established. Shall we get started?" As Danielle set up her presentation, she could feel Lauren's gaze on her. Assessing, calculating, this complicated things. As head of talent acquisition, Lauren was a key stakeholder in any diversity and inclusion initiative. If she held a grudge from their interaction on the plane, she had the power to subtly, or not so subtly, derail Danielle's proposal. But Danielle had worked too hard and prepared too thoroughly to let one difficult person rattle her. Taking a steadying breath, she launched into her presentation, determined to hold her ground. "Thank you all for the opportunity to present today," she began, making deliberate eye contact with each person at the table, including Lauren. "Sterling & Co. has built a reputation for forward-thinking leadership in the financial sector. Today, I'll be outlining how a comprehensive diversity and inclusion strategy can position you as an industry leader, not just in talent development, but in innovation and long-term organizational growth." As she moved through her slides, Danielle could sense engagement from the room. William Sterling nodded thoughtfully at her points about market expansion and competitive advantage. Catherine Langley, the COO, asked sharp, insightful questions about implementation timelines. James Halpern, the VP of HR, seemed particularly interested in the retention strategies she proposed. Only Lauren remained stone-faced, occasionally jotting down notes but offering no questions or comments. And somehow, that silence felt more pointed than any outright objection. When Danielle reached the section on metrics and accountability, Lauren finally spoke. "This all sounds very ambitious," she said, her tone carrying just enough doubt to signal skepticism. "But I'm concerned about the resources required. We already have diversity initiatives in place. What makes your approach worth the additional investment?" It was a fair question, professionally phrased, but Danielle knew there was more behind it. She met Lauren's gaze steadily. "That's an excellent question." Clicking to her next slide, she continued. "The difference lies in integration and accountability. Many companies have diversity programs that operate in silos, recruiting efforts that aren't connected to retention strategies, mentoring programs that don't align with promotion pathways." She gestured toward the data. "My framework creates a cohesive ecosystem, where each element reinforces the others, and it's measurable. Companies that have adopted similar integrated approaches have seen a 27% increase in retention of underrepresented employees, a 35% improvement in innovation-driven performance, an ROI that becomes clear within the first 18 months. Lauren opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, William Sterling cut in. "Those numbers are compelling, Miss Carter. Particularly the innovation metrics. We've been focusing on that as part of our 5-year strategic plan." Lauren's jaw tensed slightly, but she said nothing. The conversation shifted toward implementation details. Catherine Langley asked about change management strategies. James Halpern inquired about training requirements. Lauren remained quiet for the rest of the presentation, but Danielle could still feel her watchful presence, like a weight pressing against her. As the meeting wound down, William stood and extended his hand again. "Thank you, Miss Carter. You've given us a lot to consider. We'll be discussing internally and should have a decision for you by early next week." Danielle shook his hand. "I appreciate the opportunity. I look forward to hearing from you." As the others began to leave, Lauren lingered behind. Danielle continued packing up her laptop, fully aware that Lauren was watching her. After a beat, the other woman spoke, her voice low. "Quite a coincidence," Lauren mused. "You on our flight, and now in our boardroom." Danielle met her gaze evenly. Not really. Chicago is a major business hub, and Sterling & Co. is an important potential client. The odds weren't that long. Lauren adjusted her watch, a casual flick of her wrist revealing the sleek, expensive brand. You made a strong presentation, very polished. Danielle caught the slight emphasis on the last word but chose to ignore it. Thank you. I believe in Sterling & Co.'s potential to lead in this area. Lauren studied her for a moment longer, then said, just so you know, these decisions aren't made by one person, it's a team evaluation. The message was clear. Lauren might not be able to block Danielle's proposal outright, but she would certainly try to influence the outcome. Danielle's expression didn't waver. Of course. That's why I made sure to address each aspect of the strategy to different key stakeholders. Lauren's lips pressed into a thin smile. We'll be in touch. And with that, she turned and walked away. Danielle exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders to release the tension. If Lauren wanted to play this game, fine. Danielle had spent her entire career navigating people like her. She wasn't going to lose now. Everyone at the table had a stake in the success of the initiative. Danielle and Lauren regarded each other for a long moment, two professional women engaged in a subtle power struggle that had started in the confined space of an airplane cabin and now played out in the high-stakes world of corporate decision-making. Finally, Lauren exhaled, her expression unreadable. Safe travels back to wherever it is you're based. Philadelphia. Danielle replied, but I'll be in Chicago until Sunday. My mother lives here now. Something flickered across Lauren's face, maybe surprise at the personal detail, or maybe just impatience to end the conversation. Enjoy your stay then, she said coolly, turning toward the door. Someone will see you out. As Lauren's footsteps echoed down the hallway, Danielle allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. She had prepared for tough questions. For pushback on budget, strategy, and implementation. But nowhere in her risk assessment had she accounted for walking into a pitch and coming face to face with Lauren Whitman. Yet here she was, navigating not just the usual challenges of being a black woman presenting to a predominantly white executive team, but also the added complexity of personal history, with a key decision-maker. A history tainted by an unpleasant encounter that had likely left Lauren feeling embarrassed or undermined. As Danielle packed the last of her materials into her bag, her phone buzzed. How did the pitch go? Still on for coffee? Despite the unexpected complication with Lauren, Danielle felt optimistic. The other executives had responded well to her presentation. Even Lauren, for all her icy demeanor, hadn't been able to find any real flaws in the proposal. Just finished. Interesting twist. The woman from the plane works here. She's their head of talent acquisition. You're kidding. Talk about awkward. Definitely. Need to hear this story? 12:30 at Mill and Cedar Cafe? Wouldn't miss it. Checking the time, Danielle saw she had about an hour before their meeting, enough to decompress and process the morning's events. As she rode the elevator down to the lobby, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just coincidence. Some strange alignment of circumstances had placed Lauren Whitman directly in her path. The only question was whether that alignment would turn out to be an advantage or a disaster. Either way, Danielle had a feeling their interaction was far from over. Mill and Cedar Cafe occupied the ground floor of a renovated warehouse, its industrial chic design softened by abundant potted plants and massive windows that bathed the space in natural light. Spotting Jason at a corner table, already nursing what looked like a latte, Danielle made her way over. Sorry I'm late, she said, settling into the chair across from him. Took longer than expected to get a cab. No problem, Jason replied easily, taking a sip of his drink. I've been enjoying the people watching. So many hipsters with asymmetrical haircuts. Danielle laughed, feeling some of the tension from the morning's meeting begin to fade. It is a bit pretentious in here, isn't it? But apparently they have the best coffee in this part of town. Jason lifted his mug in agreement. Already confirmed. Worth the hype. After ordering her own coffee, an Americano no sugar, Danielle leaned forward. Okay, so get this. The woman from the plane? Jason raised an eyebrow. She's their head of talent acquisition. His mouth fell open slightly before he let out a low whistle. You can't be serious. That's some cosmic joke. Danielle sighed. My thoughts exactly, and of course, she's a key decision-maker for my proposal. How did she react when she saw you? Professional on the surface, but there was definitely recognition. And not the happy kind. Danielle accepted her coffee from the server with a quick, thanks, then continued. She waited until everyone else had left to basically warn me that she has influence over the decision. Jason shook his head. Unbelievable. Do you think she'll try to tank your proposal out of spite? Danielle hesitated, taking a slow sip of coffee before answering. I hope not. That would be wildly unprofessional. Jason gave her a knowing look. But people can be wildly unprofessional when their egos are involved, he finished forkily. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each contemplating the strange intersection of personal and professional that Danielle now found herself navigating. Then Jason leaned forward, an amused glint in his eyes. You know, this could actually work in your favor. Danielle raised an eyebrow. How do you figure? Think about it. If Lauren tries to oppose your proposal without legitimate business reasons, she risks exposing her bias. And from what you told me, the other executives seemed receptive to your ideas. Danielle considered this. That's true. William Sterling was particularly interested in the innovation metrics, and Catherine Langley asked thoughtful questions about implementation. If Lauren can't articulate valid concerns beyond vague resource issues, Jason nodded. Plus, there's the simple fact that you're good at what you do. Your proposal stands on its merits. Danielle smiled at the vote of confidence. I appreciate that. I just hate that personal dynamics might influence a business decision that could benefit hundreds of employees. Jason smirked. Welcome to corporate America, where merit matters, but relationships and politics matter more. Danielle groaned. Don't remind me. Their conversation shifted to Jason's conference presentation, scheduled for the next day. His research on bias in performance evaluations and the resistance he often encountered from executives who believed their assessment processes were already objective. The problem, Jason explained, is that most people equate good intentions with fair outcomes. They think that because they're not consciously trying to discriminate, their unconscious biases don't affect their judgments. Danielle nodded, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. The I don't see color fallacy. Exactly. As if pretending not to notice differences magically creates equality. Danielle exhaled, shaking her head. People want to believe the system works, because admitting it doesn't mean they have to do something about it. Jason leaned back, watching her for a moment. You know, I feel like I should be taking notes for my session tomorrow. Danielle smirked, happy to provide material. Their conversation drifted between professional frustrations and personal experiences, occasionally punctuated by laughter. For the first time since stepping onto that plane, Danielle felt like she could breathe. She wasn't sure what to make of Lauren Whitman just yet, or what impact their past encounter might have on her proposal. But sitting here, in this cozy cafe with Jason, she realized something. This trip to Chicago, which had started with so much frustration, might turn out to be far more significant than she had expected. And not just professionally. The problem, Jason continued, is that people assume that because they don't consciously discriminate, their unconscious biases don't exist. Danielle nodded. It's the I don't see color fallacy, as if pretending not to notice differences somehow creates equality. Jason exhaled. Exactly. You can't address what you refuse to acknowledge. Their discussion flowed seamlessly from professional challenges to personal experiences and back again. Danielle found herself enjoying Jason's company more than she had expected. There was something refreshing about his combination of intellectual sharpness and unpretentious warmth. He could talk about serious topics without sounding preachy, and he had an easy way of turning heavy conversations into something engaging. As they finished their coffee, Jason leaned back with a curious smile. So, what's next on your Chicago agenda? Besides waiting anxiously for Sterling & Co.'s decision? Danielle chuckled. My mother's birthday dinner tonight. Then I have a free day tomorrow before I fly back on Sunday. Any plans for tomorrow? She shook her head. Not really. Maybe some shopping on Oak Street. My mother keeps telling me I need to invest in experiences, not just achievements. Jason laughed. Sounds like good maternal advice. Would you be interested in some company for those experiences? I finish at the conference by noon. The invitation hung in the air, shifting the nature of their interaction from professional networking to something more personal. Danielle hesitated for just a second, balancing the potential complications against the genuine connection she felt with Jason. Then she smiled. "That sounds nice, but fair warning, I haven't done the tourist thing in ages. I might be terrible at it." Jason grinned. "Perfect. We can be terrible at it together. I suggest starting with the Art Institute. It's pretentious enough to satisfy our professional credentials, but actually fun enough to count as a real experience." Danielle found herself laughing, the tension from earlier in the day slowly fading. "The Art Institute it is." As they exchanged tentative plans for the next day, Danielle's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach tighten. "William Sterling," she exhaled, glancing at Jason. "I should take this." He nodded. "Go ahead." Danielle answered, keeping her tone steady. "Mr. Sterling, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." His voice came through clear and formal. "Not at all, Miss Carter. I wanted to touch base about this morning's presentation. The team and I discussed your proposal after you left, and we were quite impressed with your framework." Danielle's pulse quickened. "I'm glad to hear that. In fact, we'd like to move forward sooner than originally planned. Our board has been pushing for more concrete action on diversity initiatives, and your approach seems to align with their concerns." Danielle caught Jason's questioning look and gave him a subtle thumbs up. "That's excellent news," she said, forcing herself to stay composed. "There's one additional item," William continued. "We're hosting a charity gala tomorrow evening at the Chicago Heritage Center, a fundraiser for educational programs in underserved communities. I'd like to invite you to attend. It would be a great opportunity to meet some of our board members informally before we finalize contract details next week." Danielle hesitated for only a second before replying, "I'd be honored. Thank you for the invitation." "Wonderful. It's black tie, begins at 7. I'll have my assistant send you the details. Feel free to bring a guest if you'd like." After exchanging a few more pleasantries, Danielle ended the call and looked up to find Jason watching her with curiosity. "Good news?" he asked. Danielle exhaled a satisfied breath. "Very good news. They want to move forward with my proposal, and I've just been invited to their charity gala tomorrow night." Jason's face lit up. "That's fantastic. Congratulations," she grinned. "Thanks. Looks like Lauren didn't manage to derail things after all." Jason raised his empty coffee mug in a mock toast. "Score 1 for meritocracy," Danielle smirked. "Let's not get carried away." "Fair. So this gala, black tie, huh? Sounds fancy." "Very. It's at the Chicago Heritage Center. William mentioned I could bring a guest." She hesitated for just a moment before adding, "Would you be interested in coming? I know it's short notice, and it would mean missing our Art Institute plan." Jason's eyebrows lifted. "Are you kidding? I'd be honored. The Art Institute will still be there next time you're in Chicago." He paused, then added with a smile, "Besides, I clean up pretty well in a tuxedo, if I do say so myself." Danielle chuckled. "I don't doubt it." As they finalized their plans for the following evening, Danielle couldn't help but reflect on the strange turns her Chicago trip had taken. What had begun as a frustrating confrontation on a plane had led to a promising business opportunity. And now, possibly, something more. But one thing lingered in the back of her mind, the knowledge that Lauren Whitman would almost certainly be at the gala tomorrow night. Still smarting from their previous encounters, and perhaps looking for a way to reassert control. But that was a problem for tomorrow. For now, Danielle would focus on celebrating her mother's birthday and the incredible momentum in her career. The rest would sort itself out in due time. Danielle's mother, Evelyn Carter, had the kind of presence that could fill a room without demanding attention. A quiet dignity, honed over decades of navigating both subtle and overt discrimination. As one of the first black female physicians at her hospital, Evelyn had shattered ceilings long before Danielle had ever set foot in a corporate boardroom. Now retired at 70, she had traded Philadelphia's familiar neighborhoods for Chicago's vibrant cultural scene. A decision that had surprised Danielle at first, but now seemed entirely fitting for a woman who had never stopped evolving. "My baby girl," Evelyn said, embracing Danielle at the door of her elegant Lakeview apartment. "Right on time, as always." "Happy birthday, Mom." Danielle replied, breathing in the familiar scent of Chanel No. 5, unchanged since her childhood. The apartment was stunning. Evelyn had furnished it with an eclectic mix of cherished teaks from Philadelphia and modern pieces that complemented the sweeping views of Lake Michigan. Like her mother herself, the space managed to honor tradition while embracing new possibilities. Come in, Evelyn ushered her inside. Tell me about your meeting. Did they recognize how lucky they'd be to have you? As they settled into the living room, glasses of wine in hand, Danielle recounted the presentation at Sterling & Co., including the unexpected revelation that Lauren Whitman, the same woman from the plane, was their head of talent acquisition. Evelyn shook her head in disbelief. Lord, the universe does have a sense of humor, doesn't it? Danielle sighed. Not one I particularly appreciate in this case, but it seems to have worked out anyway. William Sterling called this afternoon. They want to move forward. Evelyn waved a hand, as if that had been inevitable. Of course they do. They'd be fools not to. Her unwavering confidence in Danielle had never wavered, not even in the moments when Danielle had doubted herself. Evelyn swirled her wine. And this Jason you mentioned? You're bringing him to the gala tomorrow? Danielle hesitated for just a moment. Yes, we just met on the plane yesterday, but there's something about him. He's smart, thoughtful, easy to talk to. Her mother studied her over the rim of her glass, a knowing look in her eyes. It's been a while since I've seen that look on your face. Not since James, I think. Danielle froze for half a second at the mention of James, the name still carrying echoes of both happiness and heartbreak. They had been engaged once, planning a future together, until he had been offered a career-defining opportunity in Singapore. They had tried long distance, tried to make it work, but time zones and careers had proven stronger than their intentions. The breakup had been amicable, respectful, but devastating all the same. Danielle quickly shook her head. This is nothing like that. Her mother took a slow sip of wine. It was the kind of response that said, I hear you, but we'll see. Danielle changed the subject. I look forward to you meeting him when the time is right, but for now, what do you say we head to dinner? I've been looking forward to this fusion place you mentioned. As they gathered their things, Danielle's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Miss Carter, this is Catherine Langley from Sterling & Co. I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. I'd like to meet for coffee tomorrow to discuss a few implementation details before the gala. If you're available. Danielle frowned slightly, intrigued by the request. She responded quickly, suggesting 11 a.m. at a cafe near her hotel. Everything okay? Evelyn asked, noticing the thoughtful look on her daughter's face. Danielle nodded. Just the COO from Sterling. Wants to meet tomorrow, probably just eager to get started. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Or perhaps she has something to discuss away from certain colleagues. Her mother's perceptiveness was as sharp as ever. Never underestimate office politics, darling. As they stepped out into the mild Chicago evening, Danielle considered her mother's words. Catherine Langley had been engaged during the presentation, asking thoughtful questions, making careful notes. But she had also exchanged several unreadable glances with Lauren Whitman during the discussion. What might she want to discuss privately, away from the structure of the boardroom? And more importantly, would it help or hinder Danielle's efforts to secure the contract? The questions lingered at the back of her mind throughout dinner, surfacing only occasionally between conversations about family, Chicago's cultural offerings, and her mother's new hobby, architectural photography. By the time they said goodnight, Danielle had resolved to approach the meeting with Catherine Langley with cautious optimism, prepared for either opportunity or challenge. Back in her hotel room, Danielle found another text waiting. This time, from Jason. Looking forward to tomorrow night. Should I pick you up at your hotel or meet you there? The simple question carried weight. The subtle shift from a professional connection to something more personal. Danielle considered for a moment before typing her response. Hotel lobby at 6:30. We can share a car to the venue. A moment later, his reply came through. Perfect. See you then. She set her phone down, an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. It had been a long time since Danielle had let herself feel the quiet thrill of possibility, not just for her career, but for something else, something unexpected, something personal. As she turned off the bedside lamp and settled into the pillows, she realized one thing. Her trip to Chicago was turning out to be far more significant than she had ever imagined. Perfect. Sweet dreams, Danielle. 3 simple words. Yet they sent a flutter of anticipation through her. One that had nothing to do with business contracts or career advancement. It had been a long time since Danielle had allowed herself to feel this particular emotion. The quiet thrill of possibility. As she prepared for bed, she reflected on how unexpected this trip to Chicago had become. What had started as a routine business presentation had evolved into a tangled web of professional opportunity, potential romance, and unresolved tensions, with Lauren Whitman hovering at the edges like a storm cloud, just waiting to make her move. Tomorrow promised 2 significant encounters: morning coffee with Catherine Langley, an evening at the gala with Jason, and undoubtedly, another collision with Lauren. The pieces were moving. Danielle just wasn't sure what pattern they were forming yet. As she drifted toward sleep, her last conscious thought was of Jason's smile across the cafe table, warm and genuine, in a world where authenticity often seemed in short supply. The next morning dawned clear and bright, Chicago's skyline etched sharply against a cloudless blue sky. Danielle spent an hour reviewing her proposal notes and preparing questions for her meeting with Catherine before heading out to the cafe they had agreed upon. It was an upscale, discreet spot, frequented by business executives who preferred to conduct sensitive discussions away from corporate walls. Danielle spotted Catherine Langley immediately. The COO, a slim woman in her early 50s with a sharp silver bob and penetrating gray eyes, was already seated at a corner table, partially hidden behind a large potted palm. As Danielle approached, Catherine stood to greet her. "Miss Carter, thank you for making time on such short notice. Please, call me Danielle. And it's no problem at all." After ordering espresso for Catherine and an Americano for Danielle, Catherine leaned forward slightly. Her voice was measured, deliberate. "I wanted to speak with you privately before things progress further with the contract." Danielle kept her expression neutral, but her curiosity was piqued. "I appreciate that approach." Catherine took a slow sip of her espresso before continuing. "I'll be direct. There's a faction within our leadership team that has been resistant to meaningful diversity initiatives. They've been content with," she made a small dismissive gesture, "superficial efforts, sponsoring diversity conferences, holding recruitment events at HBCUs, things that generate positive PR but don't address structural issues." Danielle's lips pressed together knowingly. "And let me guess, Lauren Whitman is part of that faction?" Catherine's mouth curved in a small, knowing smile. "Very perceptive. Yes, Lauren has been particularly protective of our current approach. She's built her reputation on incremental improvements in our diversity metrics, without actually changing our culture or advancement pathways." Danielle exhaled slowly. "So my proposal threatens her professional territory." "Precisely." Catherine took another sip of coffee. "And add to that whatever personal interaction occurred between you two. Yes, we all noticed the tension, and you can understand why I wanted to have this conversation." Danielle turned this information over in her mind. Lauren's resistance suddenly made perfect sense. She wasn't just defending outdated practices. She was defending her own legacy. If that's the case, why is William Sterling moving forward with my proposal? Catherine's expression shifted slightly. "Because William recognizes that we're at a crossroads." She set her cup down, lacing her fingers together. "Our board is pushing for more substantive action. Our younger employees are demanding it. And frankly, our competitors are beginning to outpace us in this area." A brief pause. "Also, between us, William's daughter recently left a promising career in finance. She described the industry as a toxic boys' club." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "And that made the issue personal for him." Catherine nodded. "Exactly." Danielle processed this new information carefully. Sterling & Co. wasn't just reacting to market trends. The pressure to evolve was coming from the top. "So where do you stand in all of this, Catherine?" The COO met her gaze directly. "I believe your approach is exactly what we need." She leaned back in her chair. "I've spent 23 years in financial services, and in that time, I've watched countless talented women and people of color leave. Not because they weren't capable, but because they couldn't see a path forward." Her voice was steady, but there was conviction beneath it. It's not just morally problematic, it's bad business. Their conversation was briefly interrupted when the server arrived with their pastries, an almond croissant for Catherine, a blueberry scone for Danielle. Once they were alone again, Danielle asked, "So what should I expect going forward? If Lauren opposes the initiative, but William supports it, where does that leave implementation?" Catherine broke off a small piece of her croissant. "That's why I wanted to meet." She gave Danielle a knowing look. "Winning the contract is just the first step. The real challenge will be navigating the internal politics during implementation." Danielle nodded. She had suspected as much. Catherine continued, "Lauren won't openly oppose something William has approved, but she has ways of creating obstacles, delaying access to necessary data, scheduling conflicts for key meetings, quietly sowing doubt among department heads whose cooperation you'll need." She shrugged slightly. "The usual passive-aggressive tactics of corporate resistance." Danielle exhaled. She had seen this before, resistance that doesn't come in the form of loud objections, but slow, subtle roadblocks. "And you're telling me this because—" Catherine leaned in slightly. "Because I want your initiative to succeed." She tilted her head. "And that means preparing you for the landscape you'll be entering." A pause. "I have influence with William, and I have relationships throughout the organization, but I need to know you're ready for what might be a challenging implementation phase." Danielle held her gaze. This was a direct offer of alliance, and it was one she needed. "I appreciate the candor, Catherine, and yes, I've navigated situations like this before." She took a sip of her coffee. "My approach usually involves identifying allies at multiple levels of an organization, not just in the C-suite, creating a coalition for change rather than relying solely on top-down mandates." Catherine's lips curled into a small, approving smile. "Good, that's exactly the right strategy, and it's why I think you're the right consultant for us." Catherine smiled, a genuine expression that momentarily softened her serious features. "That's exactly the right strategy, and it's why I think you're the right consultant for us." Despite the complications, Danielle felt the first stirrings of real momentum. For the next 45 minutes, she and Catherine dissected Sterling & Co.'s internal dynamics, identifying potential allies, likely resistors, and those who could be persuaded with the right approach. The insight was invaluable, a roadmap through company politics that would have taken Danielle weeks or even months to develop on her own. As their meeting wound down, Catherine checked her watch. "I should get back to the office. Will you be at the gala tonight?" Danielle nodded. "Yes. William invited me. I understand it's for educational programs?" Catherine smiled. "That's right. One of our better initiatives, actually. We fund college preparation programs for students from underprivileged neighborhoods in the city. It started as a PR effort, to be honest, but it's grown into something meaningful." She gathered her things, then paused. "Lauren will be there tonight." Danielle exhaled through her nose. "Of course she will. She's on the gala committee, isn't she?" "She chairs it." Danielle couldn't quite keep the dryness from her tone. "Naturally." Catherine's eyes crinkled with amusement. "I have a feeling you can handle Lauren Whitman. Just remember, appearances matter at these events. Maintain the high ground, especially with board members watching." Danielle lifted her chin slightly. "Professional composure is practically my middle name." Catherine extended her hand. "Good, then I'll see you tonight." As Catherine departed, Danielle lingered at the table, finishing her coffee and processing the wealth of information she had just received. The meeting had clarified a lot about the situation at Sterling & Co., but it had also added new layers of complexity. Catherine was a valuable ally, but Danielle had been in the consulting business long enough to know that alliances were rarely static. Motivations shifted. Loyalties evolved. Today's supporter could easily become tomorrow's obstacle. Still, having the COO on her side was a powerful advantage. And Catherine's understanding of the company's internal landscape would prove critical during implementation. The only wild card left was Lauren Whitman, and whatever new animosity might unfold at tonight's gala. Danielle checked the time. Just past noon. She had several hours to prepare. Back at her hotel, she laid her evening gown across the bed. A midnight blue, floor-length dress with subtle silver threading. Professional, yet elegant. It struck the right balance for an event where she was both a guest and a prospective contractor. Just as she was about to start getting ready, her phone buzzed. Jason. Looking forward to tonight. Fair warning, I cannot dance at all. It's embarrassing. Danielle smiled, typing back quickly. Noted. We'll stick to the edges of the dance floor. Also, just had an interesting meeting with the COO. Lots to fill you in on tonight. His response came almost immediately. Intrigued. Corporate intrigue over champagne? Sounds perfect. Danielle chuckled. Despite the challenges that lay ahead at Sterling & Co., at least she had good company tonight. And maybe, if the evening went well, something more than just business to look forward to in Chicago. The Chicago Heritage Center stood as a testament to the city's dedication to preserving history while embracing progress. A Beaux-Arts landmark with contemporary art exhibits beneath its stunning glass domes. As their car pulled up to the entrance, its grand facade glowed with warm ambient lighting, illuminating intricate architectural details. Jason stepped out first, then turned to offer his arm. Danielle hesitated just a second before taking it. Impressive venue, Jason remarked as they ascended the steps. Danielle surveyed the elegantly dressed crowd flowing into the building. Sterling & Co. doesn't do things halfway, I see. Jason chuckled. Apparently not. Inside, the grand atrium had been transformed for the evening. Round tables elegantly set for dinner surrounded a central dance floor. A string quartet played from a small stage, their music weaving seamlessly into the murmurs of conversation. Large banners highlighted the night's cause, funding educational programs for students from underprivileged communities. Danielle took in the scene with a consultant's skepticism. Catherine mentioned that the company funds college preparation programs in the city, she said. I'm curious to see how much of this is genuine commitment versus corporate image polishing. Jason glanced at her with a small smile. Always the consultant, analyzing the underlying motivations. She exhaled a quiet laugh. Occupational hazard, sorry. Don't be. It's refreshing. Most people take corporate philanthropy at face value. Before she could respond, a familiar voice greeted them. Danielle, so glad you could make it. She turned to see William Sterling approaching, resplendent in a classic tuxedo, champagne flute in hand. In his early 60s, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to influence, he cut an impressive figure. Thank you for the invitation, William, Danielle said smoothly. She gestured toward Jason. This is Jason Reed, a colleague from Telstra Financial. Jason extended a hand. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sterling. William returned the handshake. Call me William. And yes, we're lucky to have access to such a historic venue for our annual gala. The proceeds from tonight will fund college prep programs for promising students in the city. He gestured toward a large display near the entrance, where photos of students and alumni from the initiative were showcased. So far, we've helped over 70 students attend top-tier universities. Danielle studied the display, surprised by how legitimate it seemed. She turned back to William. That's commendable, William nodded. Well, it's a start. He turned his attention back to Danielle. Catherine tells me your diversity framework might help us extend similar opportunities within our own organization. Danielle nodded. That's certainly one of the goals, creating structured pathways for talent that might otherwise be overlooked or underutilized. William took a sip of his champagne, then said, I'd like to introduce you to some of our board members later. They're particularly interested in how we can translate our external commitments into internal practices. Danielle smiled. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had hoped for. But as she glanced around the room, she knew that not everyone in attendance would be rooting for her success. Across the crowd, she caught a glimpse of Lauren Whitman, effortlessly elegant in a deep red gown, speaking with a group of senior executives. Their eyes met for the briefest second. Lauren's smile remained in place, but there was something sharp behind it. The evening had just begun, and the real game was about to start. Danielle smiled politely as William gestured toward a distinguished-looking man approaching their group. Julian, come meet our newest consultant. A black man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo with subtle yet deliberate details, gold cufflinks shaped like scales of justice, stepped forward with an air of quiet authority. Danielle recognized the subtle markers of legacy and influence. Julian Brooks, William introduced. Danielle Carter and Jason Reed. Danielle will be leading our new diversity initiative. Julian shook their hands firmly. Excellence. It's about time Sterling & Co. brought in fresh leadership on this issue. I've been pushing for it for years. William chuckled. Julian is being modest. He's been our conscience on diversity matters since joining the board 5 years ago. Before that, he led the Chicago Business Equity Coalition and has spent decades advocating for structural change. Danielle immediately recognized a potential ally. It's a pleasure, Mr. Brooks. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Sterling's current challenges and opportunities in this space. Julian nodded knowingly. Absolutely. Find me later tonight. I have plenty to share. His warm smile held an unspoken understanding, one professional of color to another, including perspectives that might not make it into the official briefing materials. As Julian and William were drawn away by other guests, Jason leaned closer to Danielle. Well, that seems promising. A board member already aligned with your objectives. Danielle sipped her champagne. Yes, and one with significant community credibility. She scanned the room, observing who gravitated toward whom, who was engaged in genuine conversations, and who was simply there for the networking optics. From across the hall, she spotted Lauren Whitman, dressed in an elegant red gown, moving efficiently between event staff and VIP guests. Despite her central role in the event, she had yet to approach Danielle directly. Jason followed her gaze. She's avoiding you. Danielle kept her expression neutral. Probably for the best. Jason smirked. Probably. But I've seen enough boardroom politics to know that people who retreat quietly usually come back with a more calculated approach. Danielle exhaled. Exactly. Their assigned dinner table was a strategic mix of power players. Julian Brooks and his wife, a federal judge, a young tech entrepreneur who was a major donor to the education initiative, and 2 Sterling & Co. vice presidents from departments Danielle would be working with closely. Conversation flowed smoothly, ranging from Chicago politics to emerging financial technologies and, inevitably, the challenges of meaningful diversity in corporate America. As dessert arrived, Julian leaned back in his chair, folding his hands thoughtfully. The problem, he said, is that too many companies see diversity as a numbers game rather than a cultural transformation. Danielle nodded. They focus on recruitment without addressing retention and advancement. Julian raised his glass slightly. Exactly. Bringing people in the door means nothing if they don't see a path forward once they're inside. That's what impressed me about your proposal, Danielle. Catherine Langley chimed in, setting down her wine glass. Your emphasis on measurable outcomes beyond just representation. Danielle glanced at Catherine, appreciating the endorsement. Because representation isn't enough, she continued. We have to look at whether employees, especially those from historically underrepresented backgrounds, can actually thrive within the system. As the discussion continued, Danielle became aware of a presence approaching the table. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Lauren Whitman. The moment she had been anticipating all evening. Lauren's professional smile was firmly in place as she greeted the group. I hope everyone is enjoying the evening, she said, her gaze sweeping across the table before finally settling on Danielle. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered behind her polished exterior. The program portion will begin in 15 minutes, Lauren continued smoothly, followed by dancing and the silent auction results. Julian raised his glass slightly. Excellent event as always, Lauren. The committee has outdone itself. Lauren's smile warmed noticeably. Thank you, Julian. Danielle observed the subtle shift. Lauren respected Julian. Not surprising. His influence extended beyond the boardroom, into business, philanthropy, and community leadership. Catherine leaned in, her tone pleasant, but holding an edge Danielle couldn't quite place. I'm sure the new matching grant from the Sterling Family Foundation will push fundraising totals even higher this year. Lauren's smile flickered for a split second, a barely perceptible reaction, but Danielle caught it. Annoyance, frustration. She recovered quickly. Yes, William's daughter Charlotte was instrumental in securing that funding. She's become quite involved in the foundation's work since leaving investment banking. Danielle noted the precision in Lauren's words. She didn't say since leaving a toxic work culture, she said since leaving investment banking. Subtle, but pointed. Danielle exchanged a glance with Catherine. Lauren was too controlled for a direct confrontation. Instead, she was redirecting the narrative. Then, finally, Lauren turned her attention fully to Danielle. "Miss Carter," she said smoothly, as if they had never met before. "I trust you're enjoying the evening? Your first Sterling Gala, I believe?" Danielle met her gaze evenly. "It's impressive." She kept her voice calm, neutral. "The education program seems to be making a real impact." Lauren's smile remained intact. "Yes, we're quite proud of it. Authentic community impact requires sustained commitment, not just fashionable initiatives that look good in annual reports." Danielle didn't blink. The implication was clear enough. She refused to take the bait. "I couldn't agree more," Danielle replied evenly. Sustainable transformation requires both strategic vision and long-term investment. Lauren's eyes flicked briefly to Jason before settling back on Danielle. "And you must be Miss Carter's colleague?" The slight pause before colleague was deliberate. Jason extended his hand, his tone deliberately neutral. "Jason Reed, Telstra Financial. Danielle and I met recently through professional circles." Lauren's smile didn't waver. "How fortunate that you were available on such short notice for tonight's event." Danielle felt Jason's posture shift slightly beside her, a subtle gesture of quiet support. Before either of them could respond, Julian smoothly intervened. "Networking is the lifeblood of our industry, isn't it, Lauren?" His tone was polite, but his eyes held a warning. Some of the most valuable professional connections happen unexpectedly. Lauren held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then, with practiced ease, she inclined her head slightly. "Indeed." With a final glance at Danielle, she added, "Enjoy the rest of your evening." And just like that, she drifted back into the crowd. Jason exhaled quietly. "Well, that was subtle." Danielle picked up her champagne flute and took a slow sip. "Subtle opposition is the hardest kind to fight." Julian chuckled under his breath. "I wouldn't worry too much." He nodded toward the board members watching from across the room. "Lauren may play her games, but it looks like you already have the right people paying attention." Danielle followed his gaze. Across the room, William Sterling and two other board members were watching her with interest. Lauren had made her first move, but the real battle was just beginning. Danielle met Lauren's gaze evenly, her voice smooth and composed. "It's an impressive event." She didn't blink, didn't react. "The education program seems to be making a real impact." Lauren's professional smile never wavered. "Yes, we're quite proud of it. Authentic community impact requires sustained commitment, not just fashionable initiatives that look good in annual reports." Danielle caught the implication immediately. Lauren wasn't just making conversation, she was drawing a line in the sand, but Danielle had no intention of taking the bait. "I couldn't agree more," she replied evenly. "Sustainable transformation requires both strategic vision and long-term investment." Jason shifted slightly beside her, a subtle gesture of support. Lauren's eyes flicked to him, then back to Danielle. "And you must be Miss Carter's colleague?" The slight pause before colleague was deliberate. Jason extended his hand, his tone pleasantly neutral. "Jason Reed, Telstra Financial. Danielle and I met recently through professional circles." Lauren's smile didn't falter. "How fortunate that you were available on such short notice for tonight's event." Danielle kept her posture relaxed, but before she or Jason could respond, Julian Brooks smoothly intervened. "Networking is the lifeblood of our industry, isn't it, Lauren?" His tone was casual, but his eyes held a warning. Some of the most valuable professional connections develop unexpectedly. Lauren tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the gentle rebuke. "Indeed." Then, with one last glance at Danielle, she said, "Enjoy the rest of your evening." And just like that, she drifted back into the crowd. Jason exhaled. "Well, that was subtle." Danielle picked up her champagne flute and took a slow sip. "Subtle opposition is the hardest kind to fight." Julian chuckled under his breath. "I wouldn't worry too much." He nodded toward the board members across the room. "Lauren may play her games, but it looks like you already have the right people paying attention." Danielle followed his gaze. Across the room, William Sterling and two other board members were watching her with interest. Lauren had made her first move, but the real battle was just beginning. As the program portion of the gala began, a student speaker took the stage, sharing how the Sterling Scholars Program had helped her attend a top-tier university. Applause rippled through the ballroom. Then, William Sterling stepped up to the podium, announcing that the evening had already raised $1.2 million, with the silent auction still in progress. Danielle couldn't ignore the way Lauren's public persona shifted seamlessly. Her speech was poised, passionate, painting a compelling vision of educational opportunity. Jason leaned in slightly. "Different person up there," he murmured. Danielle nodded. "The public version. Everyone has one." As the formal program concluded, the string quartet transitioned into a jazz ensemble, and guests filtered onto the dance floor or circled the silent auction displays. Julian and his wife, Gloria, excused themselves to greet other board members. Catherine was drawn into conversation with major donors. Jason turned to Danielle. "Would you care to dance?" Danielle hesitated. "Despite my warning about my limited abilities?" Jason grinned. "I'm willing to take the risk." To her own surprise, Danielle took his hand. The dance floor was comfortably crowded, allowing them to blend into the movement of other couples. Jason had undersold his skills. He moved with an easy rhythm, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back as they fell into step effortlessly. "So," he said after a moment, "quite an evening. You've made some powerful allies in Julian Brooks and Catherine Langley." Danielle exhaled. "And a determined adversary in Lauren Whitman." Her eyes drifted across the room, where Lauren stood in deep conversation with an older man, someone Danielle recognized from Sterling & Co.'s leadership team. Jason followed her gaze. "True, but she seems outnumbered at this point, and she's far less subtle than she probably thinks she is." Danielle let out a quiet laugh. "That's actually helpful. Obvious opposition is easier to navigate than the covert kind." They danced in comfortable silence, the jazz quartet playing a mellow rendition of The Way You Look Tonight. Despite the complexities surrounding them, Danielle found herself genuinely enjoying the moment. The warmth of Jason's presence, the rhythm of the music, the unexpected ease between them. She glanced up at him. "Thank you for coming with me tonight." Jason's smile was warm, reaching his eyes. "My pleasure." Literally. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "It's not every day I get to attend a black tie gala with the most impressive woman in the room." Danielle felt a flush of warmth rise to her face. "Hardly that." Jason shook his head. "I beg to differ. But I won't embarrass you by listing the evidence." The song ended just as William Sterling approached. "Danielle, I was hoping to introduce you to a few more board members before the evening concludes. Would you mind joining us for a few minutes?" Danielle glanced at Jason apologetically. He smiled easily. "Go. Make your moves. I'll check out the silent auction." She gave his hand a quick squeeze before stepping away. As she followed William across the ballroom, she caught one last glimpse of Lauren. Lauren wasn't watching the board members. She was watching Danielle. And this time, there was no smile, just calculated observation. Danielle lifted her chin slightly. Lauren wasn't finished, and neither was she. Jason squeezed Danielle's hand lightly before heading toward the silent auction. "Take your time," he said easily. William led her toward a group of 3 board members standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Ashland Square. "Danielle, I'd like you to meet some of our senior board members," he said. The men, all in their late 50s or 60s, all power players in finance and business, studied her with polite but measured interest. Julian had clearly been working behind the scenes. "Julian has been quite persuasive about the need for more substantive action," one of them, a retired banking executive, remarked. "And frankly, we all know the financial sector has lagged behind in this area." Another, a CEO in manufacturing, added, "My daughter works in tech. She tells me they've made real progress on inclusive cultures. We need to learn from that." Danielle engaged them thoughtfully, answering their questions with precision and insight. These men weren't just figureheads, they held the power to shape the company's future. Winning them over meant securing her position and her initiative's survival. She could feel it happening in real time. The conversation was going well. And yet, from across the room, Lauren was watching. Danielle's eyes flicked to her just as Lauren lifted her champagne flute, a gesture that could have been a polite toast or a veiled challenge. By the time Danielle looked back, Lauren had disappeared into the crowd. But the message had been clear. This wasn't over. By 11 p.m., the gala had begun to wind down, guests filtering out into the cool city night. Danielle and Jason retrieved their coats. As they waited for the valet, Jason glanced at her. Successful night? Danielle exhaled, letting the tension melt away. Very. I connected with several board members who seemed genuinely committed to meaningful change. Jason raised an eyebrow. Including the Lauren factor? Danielle smiled wryly. Including that. But I'm less concerned now. She has influence, but not as much as she probably thinks. Their car arrived. As they slid into the back seat, Jason turned to her. Your hotel? It was a simple question, but the unspoken weight behind it lingered in the air. Danielle hesitated. There was an undeniable connection between them. A quiet pull. A potential path neither of them had fully acknowledged. But tonight wasn't the time. I think that's best, she said finally. Jason didn't miss a beat. Of course. If he was disappointed, he didn't show it. Instead, his smile remained warm, sincere. I've enjoyed every minute, though. Danielle felt something in her chest tighten, just slightly. So have I. A pause, then softer. And I'd like to see you again. Jason leaned back against the seat, studying her for a moment. Maybe next time you're in New York, or when I'm back here. Danielle nodded. No boardrooms, no corporate politics, just us. Jason's smile widened. I'd like that. They fell into easy conversation as they drove through the glowing skyline, the city humming with life around them. Danielle reflected on the strange sequence of events that had led her here. From an unpleasant encounter on an airplane, to an unexpected professional opportunity, to a connection she hadn't seen coming. Perhaps that was the real lesson. The most meaningful moments in life weren't always meticulously planned. Sometimes, they simply unfolded, waiting to see how you'd respond. As they pulled up to her hotel, Jason walked her to the lobby. There was a brief moment of hesitation, an almost imperceptible shift in the air between them. Then, I'll call you tomorrow after my flight lands, Danielle said. Jason's gaze softened just slightly. And thank you again for tonight. His smile was genuine. It was entirely my pleasure. And then, he leaned in. The kiss landed softly on her cheek, warm but unassuming. A perfectly balanced gesture, somewhere between friendly and something more. Danielle stepped into the elevator, her lips curving into a small, thoughtful smile. Whatever complications Lauren Whitman might throw her way, whatever challenges lay ahead, tonight had reminded her of something far more important. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Invest in experiences, not just achievements. Perhaps it was time to take that advice more seriously. Danielle stood by the window of her temporary office at Sterling & Co., gazing out at the city's golden skyline as the day faded into twilight. Her third week of implementation, and despite expected challenges, progress was happening faster than anticipated. She owed much of that to the allies she had cultivated. Catherine Langley had proven to be a powerful advocate, leveraging her authority as COO to clear obstacles and ensure executive buy-in. Julian Brooks had been just as instrumental, using his board position to apply pressure from the top down. Even William Sterling had shown genuine commitment, personally attending key meetings and aligning the initiative with the company's long-term strategy. And Lauren? She remained civil. She showed up to required meetings, provided requested data, though sometimes delayed. She never outright opposed the initiative, but Danielle felt the constant, subtle resistance. The carefully worded concerns designed to sow doubt, the strategic delays, the calculated devil's advocate moments, always raising questions, never outright objecting. It was exactly the kind of passive resistance Catherine had warned her about. But Danielle had navigated these waters before. Winning over an opponent like Lauren Whitman wasn't about confrontation, it was about strategy. It was about giving them a way to shift positions without losing face. Danielle had a plan, and she was just getting started. Danielle glanced out the window, the city's skyline flickering against the darkening sky. 3 weeks into implementation at Sterling & Co., and despite some expected challenges, things were moving faster than anticipated. That was in part thanks to key allies. Catherine Langley had been instrumental, using her COO authority to remove bureaucratic roadblocks and push department heads into action. Julian Brooks had done his part from the board level, offering guidance on navigating the firm's power dynamics. Even William Sterling had publicly tied the initiative to the company's 5-year strategy, making it clear that diversity wasn't just a side project, it was a top-level priority. But Lauren Whitman? She remained diplomatic but resistant. She attended required meetings, submitted requested data, sometimes late. Publicly, she gave just enough support to avoid scrutiny. Yet in every executive discussion, her presence was felt. The pointed questions meant to highlight challenges, the carefully framed concerns that sowed doubt just enough to slow momentum. Exactly the kind of passive resistance Catherine had warned her about. But Danielle had dealt with this before. Winning over someone like Lauren Whitman wasn't about forcing change, it was about strategy. And Danielle had a plan. A soft knock at her door pulled Danielle from her thoughts. Catherine stood there, coat in hand, an amused glint in her eyes. "Got a minute?" "Of course," Danielle said, gesturing to the small conference table in her office. Catherine settled into a chair, crossing one leg over the other. "I wanted to check in before I head out." Danielle sat across from her. "I was just wrapping up for the day." Catherine studied her for a beat before speaking. "I've been hearing good things. Your department sessions have people more engaged than I've seen in a long time." Boo. Danielle gave a small nod. "I find that when people understand how diversity impacts innovation and problem solving, they stop seeing it as just a compliance issue." Catherine smiled. "Exactly. Though I've also noticed something interesting." She tilted her head slightly. "Lauren's assistant cornered me today, wanted to know if I'd seen the preliminary listening session data." Danielle arched a brow. "Did she say why?" Catherine's lips quirked. She seemed very interested in the employee satisfaction scores, specifically among women in middle management. "Apparently, Lauren's been floating the idea that your initiative is setting unrealistic expectations, that it could lead to disappointment and disengagement." Danielle exhaled through her nose. Classic corporate maneuver. When direct opposition wasn't an option, reframe the narrative. "We're just concerned about unintended consequences." Catherine shook her head. "I shut it down, of course, but I thought you should know." Danielle tapped her fingers lightly on the table. Then, she smiled. "Actually, this might be an opportunity." Catherine leaned in. "How so?" Danielle reached for her tablet, pulling up the latest data from the listening sessions. "Engagement from women in middle management is actually one of the highest we've seen. They're responding positively to structured career pathways, ones that don't rely on informal networks they've historically been excluded from." Catherine's brows lifted slightly. "So Lauren's talking point actually highlights an early success." Danielle nodded. "If presented correctly." A pause. Then, "I've also been thinking about how to involve Lauren more directly. Resistance from the head of talent acquisition makes implementation harder than it needs to be." Catherine gave her a knowing look. "And you have a strategy, I assume?" Danielle leaned back slightly, folding her arms. "I'm considering asking her to co-lead the mentorship program design." Catherine blinked, then laughed softly. "That's clever. It's a high-visibility component. It aligns with her expertise, and it gives her a stake in the success of the overall framework." Catherine smirked. "And if she declines?" Danielle shrugged, a small, deliberate movement. "Then it makes her opposition more obvious, which, given the board's support for this initiative, would be politically risky." Catherine exhaled in amusement. "An elegant trap. I knew we hired the right consultant." They wrapped up a few final details before Catherine glanced at her watch and stood. "I should go. My husband's actually cooking tonight, which happens approximately once per fiscal quarter." Danielle chuckled. "Enjoy it while you can." As Catherine moved toward the door, she paused. Then, "By the way, how are things with your New York connection?" "Jason, wasn't it?" Danielle blinked. The question caught her slightly off guard. She and Jason had been in regular contact since the gala. Frequent texts, late-night calls, a plan for him to visit next month. Something was growing between them. Something real. But they were both busy, ambitious people in different cities, so they were proceeding with cautious optimism. Still, a smile tugged at her lips. "It's promising," Danielle admitted. "We're taking it slow, but yes, there's definitely a connection there." Catherine's expression softened slightly, something close to warmth in her normally calculated demeanor. "Good for you." Then, with a teasing smirk, "Just don't let it derail my diversity initiative." Danielle rolled her eyes playfully. "Don't worry. I'm very good at multitasking." Catherine winked and headed out, leaving Danielle alone with her thoughts. She turned back toward the window, watching as the city lights flickered to life. So much had changed in just a few weeks. The initiative was moving forward. Lauren was still a wild card, but Danielle was playing a long game. And Jason was becoming something she hadn't expected. Danielle's phone buzzed. A text. Jason Reed, landed in New York. Miss our coffee dates? When's my turn to visit Philly? Danielle bit her lip, smiling at her screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing. Your turn? Next month, I think. Hope you're free. His reply came almost instantly. For you? Always. Danielle locked her phone and exhaled. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, personally or professionally, she was ready for them. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just building a career, she was building a life. As Catherine left her office, Danielle turned back toward the window, watching as the city's skyline flickered to life. The conversation had left her feeling professionally affirmed, yet personally reflective. Her phone buzzed. A text. Jason Reed. Just landed in Boston for that conference. Any chance you're free for dinner tomorrow night? Danielle's lips curved into a smile. She hadn't known he'd be in town. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a second before replying. Definitely. 7:30 at Oak and Vine. I'll make the reservation. His reply came almost instantly. Perfect. Can't wait to see you. She locked her phone, tucking it away, feeling a small, unexpected rush of anticipation. Danielle had one more meeting in the morning, followed by department sessions in the afternoon, but she could certainly make time for dinner. As she packed up her laptop and notes, her mind drifted back to the strange sequence of events that had led her here. A confrontation over an airplane seat had somehow launched both a major professional opportunity and a potentially life-changing personal connection. Life's trajectories were rarely linear, she reflected. Sometimes, the most challenging moments created unexpected pathways to growth and connection. And sometimes justice and opportunity emerged from the very situations designed to diminish or exclude. With that thought, Danielle switched off the office light, stepped out into the cool evening air, and walked toward the city's glittering skyline. A skyline that, for the first time in a long while, felt full of new possibilities.